Welcome to all of you from around the world to today's Schiller Institute International Conference. Our conference is entitled, All Moral Resources of Humanity Have to be Called Up. Mankind must be the immortal species. To introduce this theme, we're going to begin today with remarks from the late economist and statesman Lyndon LaRouche, a co-founder of the Schiller Institute, and as you will see, one of the foremost thinkers of the 20th and 21st centuries.
This is truly the most important of all strategic questions we have to face today. The fact that the human species, which is absolutely unique in its capabilities, there's no other known species in the universe ever known to have existed or could exist, even though we have not fully explored, of course, the Crab Nebula or similar parts of the great galaxy which we're involved in, called the Milky Way. There may be many species with cognitive powers out there, because the solar system, of which we are immediately a product, though always under the control of the galactic processes. And we know a good deal today about those kinds of things. Our organization in the United States has spent a good deal of effort on concentrating inclusively on just this question. How old is life? How long has life existed in this galaxy, or within some place in it? What is the nature of mankind, who's been on this planet only for a few million years? There was no human being on this planet, to the best of our knowledge, until a few million years ago. And yet, we're talking about billions of years of this galaxy, during which all living processes known to us have come into existence. And all life is creative, but there's a sad part, that over 95% of all known living species have been rendered extinct as failures in their time. The question, therefore, why, in these times, when we've entered a period in which there will be more great kills of living processes at this phase of the movement of the solar system through the galaxy, why should we be so presumptuous as to imagine that human life is not about to disappear as the dinosaurs did in the last great kill? What is there about human beings that says they're not just another animal species ready to get to the chop in the course of their time? The answer is a very little known question. Most people don't have an inkling of what the answer is. As a matter of fact, our societies are run on the basis of people have no inkling what the human species is. All they can come up with is an explanation of some kind of an animal, with animal characteristics, of pleasure and pain and things like that, that might control the behavior of this animal. So why should we expect that we have a right to claim that the human species is going to survive the approaching point of a great kill in the course of the movements of the solar system up and below and around the galaxy we inhabit? How do we know that this 62 million year cycle is not going to take the human species away, as it's taken so many away before, and then before that, and then before that? And here you all these people talking about politics, they're talking about issues of politics, they're talking about practical opinion and public opinion and differentiations and costumes and all those kinds of things. And here we are, we're approaching the time of the great kill where everything about us may suddenly disappear. So what are we worried about? If we're going to disappear, why do we worry? Why do we fight it? What is there in us that is not in other living species known to us, that might somehow miraculously pronounce a destiny for our human species which we grant to no other living species? The name for that specific quality which we know in the human species which does not exist in any other known living species is a quality of creativity which is absolutely unique to mankind. And if you're not creative, and if you don't understand creativity, you haven't got a ticket to survival yet. Because creativity won't save you unless you use it. All you have to do is adopt a zero growth policy, a zero technological growth policy. I can guarantee you your extinction will come deliberately on time. I don't know what the time is, but it's soon in terms of geological and galactic time. So what are you living for? Why do you believe there's a future for your species? Why do you believe you should have grandchildren? Why should you exist? Now, how often do you hear the question which I have just posed discussed in policy making of nations? Here we are, the most important thing for any species to consider, its extinction and the possibility of not becoming extinct. A possibility known to us, or can be known to us if we're not stubbornly opposed to learning it, which is called human creativity, a phenomenon which does not exist as human creativity, as willful creativity in any other known species that ever lived to our knowledge.
For those that would like to know more about the works of Lyndon LaRouche, we invite you to acquire this volume of Lyndon LaRouche's collected works, which is available from the LaRouche Legacy Fund. We'll say more about this during the course of the conference. It contains works such as So You Wish to Learn All About Economics, There Are No Limits to Growth, and other works. To deliver our keynote for our conference today, All Moral Resources of Humanity Have to Be Called Up. Mankind must be the immortal species. It's my honor, as always, to introduce the founder and chairman of the Schiller Institute, Helga Zepp-LaRouche, who will keynote our conference on the topic, A Terrible End or a New Paradigm?
Well, I greet you, and I'm very happy to speak to you at what end of the world, wherever you may be watching this conference, because, you know, we are at an extremely decisive moment. To start with an optimistic possibility, or rather, let's make a Gedanken experiment, a thought experiment. It would be actually quite easy to solve almost any of the many problems we are confronted with today. If the majority of the governments of the European nations and possibly even the United States administration would say, okay, we messed up. We have to change our way of thinking. We committed a lot of mistakes. We neglected investment in basic infrastructure. We made policy favoring speculation over the real economy. We allow our farmers to be ruined at a time of a hunger crisis of biblical dimensions. We should have known that we could not win the war in Afghanistan, which turned into an unmitigated disaster. We did nothing to help to overcome the poverty in Africa. We turned countries which were friendly and open to us, like Russia and China, unnecessarily into adversaries by pushing geopolitical provocations. We seem to be unable to get the pandemic under control because we don't want to reverse the privatization of the health system, and we only care about the rich countries in terms of vaccines. We neglected our great humanist classical cultures. We allowed the minds of our populations to be poisoned with totally depraved entertainment industry. We allowed our youth to despair about the coming end of the world by streamlining the media with pseudo-scientific propaganda about the climate. Because we recognize that we are about to drive the whole system against the wall, we change. And we join with the countries of the Belt and Road Initiative and work together with Russia, China, and other nations to solve all of these problems, which we can, because together we are the creative species. It would be really easy. But is it likely to happen? Unfortunately not. Because so far, despite one policy failure after the other, the establishments of the West have shown zero capability to recognize and admit their mistakes and make the appropriate corrections. As a consequence, it is more likely that the entire transatlantic system is about to disintegrate. Remember these sentences? Our republic belongs today to the 10 most powerful industrial nations in the world, to the roughly 24 countries with the highest living standard. The man who spoke those words on October 6, 1989 was Erich Honecker. 12 days later, he was out of office, and 34 days later, the Berlin Wall opened up. At that time, Pope John Paul II warned that one should not draw the conclusion out of the demise of the communist system that the Western liberal system would be morally superior. And if anybody had any doubt, one should look at the horrible condition of the developing countries. In this period, I made many speeches where I warned if one would make the mistake to superimpose the neoliberal system on the whole world, and that is exactly what was attempted and implicitly in the euphemism about the end of history of Fukuyama, and explicit in the idea of an unipolar world, it would lead to an even more dramatic collapse of the whole system. And I think this is exactly where we are now. I think we are on the verge of a systemic collapse of the neoliberal system. It will take a different form than the end of the GDR and the Soviet Union, but this system is in a process of self-destruction. The existential threat to the Western world does not come from the so-called autocratic systems and dictatorships of the planet or any outside enemy at all, but entirely from the moral decadence resulting out of the cultural paradigm shift which started in the 60s and which was clairvoyant identified by Lyndon LaRouche at the time, and whose long-term effect we experience today. Unless there is a sudden reversal of that paradigm shift, what they call the, quote, rules-based order, we will plunge into a dark age with very similar characteristics as the 14th century or worse. It will lead to total chaos on the planet and world war. For the last 2 weeks at the COP26 event in Glasgow, they tried to induce the nations of this world to swallow policies to reduce CO2 emissions, which, if implemented, would lead to a population reduction by the billions and dismantle the industrial nations to a pre-industrial state, which was fortunately a basic failure since Russia, China, and several developing nations obviously have recognized the evil intention of that crowd and only sent lower level delegations and asserted completely different priorities, such as the right for development for their countries or energy security. But it is also registered that not once was there on the part of the organizers a discussion of the catastrophic condition of already existing famine in many countries or a breakdown of the health system or the refugee crisis. Please show the clip now.
Right here. Oh, yeah.
Your inaction is violence. Climate change is a gender issue.
We're going to ask everybody to clear the chamber.
It is a class issue. Your inaction is violence.
Well, these poor misled youth, misled by a financial oligarchy, are clearly not in the real world. No concern about the reality of mass starvation in the developing countries, the breakdown of civilization. After several years of apocalyptic scenarios that the planet will boil over, that was Obama, or that we only have 12 years left, this was Friday for Future and many others, or only 18 months, this was 18 months ago Prince Charles, a mass psychological effect has induced terrible effects. According to the British Medical Journal, levels of eco-anxieties, especially among young children and youth, have led to a dramatic rise of depression, low mood, extreme mental stress, suicide. According to The Lancet, a survey of 10,000 young people aged 16 to 25 in 10 countries found that 84 are worried about the global warming, 59% are extremely worried, 40% don't want to have children. And the Figaro, reporting about this, adds, each fewer child born would avoid emitting 58 tons of CO2 per year. That's 50 round trips from Paris to New York. Now, contrast this mob shown in the video clip and controlled by the financial oligarchy with the reality of mass starvation around the world. On November 8th, the World Food Programme made an emergency statement that 45 million people are on the brink of starvation worldwide. In Haiti, Ethiopia, Somalia, Kenya, Burundi, Yemen, Syria, Afghanistan. And that figure is rising exponentially because of the rise of the price of fuel, food, fertilizer. And David Beasley was just in Kabul, where he said that we are facing in Afghanistan the worst humanitarian crisis on the planet, where 95% of the population is in danger of starvation in the next 6 months, and that there will be hell on earth. And what is the reaction of the West? After 20 years of war, cost for the US was $2 trillion, and you have to add other NATO countries' cost, which left the country completely destroyed. The West is now withholding $9 billion by the US Treasury, 430 million by Commerzbank, similar amounts by Bundesbank, Bank of International Settlement, and so forth. And their argument is, unless the Taliban fulfill certain conditions, this money will not be delivered. What do you think will happen when more than 30 million people in Afghanistan, about to starve and freeze to death this winter, how many million will try to get to Europe? According to the International Organization on Migration, already at the end of 2020, there were 281 million migrants in the world, plus about 55 million displaced migrants within countries. That makes 336 million refugees. And with a US population of 229.5 million, that is 6 million people more than the entire US population. And this is happening under the condition of a pandemic, which is still completely out of control. Now there is a huge crisis at the border between Belarus and Poland, with several thousands of refugees who have no food, no water, no shelter in freezing temperatures. And what has the Polish government done? They sent 15,000 Polish soldiers. They have erected barbed wire. They're accusing, together with the EU, that Lukashenko would be a dictator, having sent these people deliberately as a hybrid warfare. NATO General Secretary Stoltenberg is already involved, making statements. There are calls for NATO backing up Poland, and the accusation that these refugees are sent deliberately is completely fraudulent. These are refugees coming from Iraq, Syria, Congo, Cameroon, and other places. And it is not Lukashenko's fault that they are there. But that the United States and other countries conducted a war against Iraq in 2003 based on lies, which has never really stopped ever since. They imposed the so-called Caesar sanctions on Syria to cause a regime change against the Assad government by hungering the population to death, so hopefully they would rise up. And this, according to Cardinal Zenari, from Syria, has thrown over 90% of the population into food insecurity and extreme poverty. Dmitry Polyansky, the charge d'affaires of the Russian mission at the United Nations, who has addressed this Schiller conference repeatedly in the past, reports that in many instances, refugees have been beaten at the Polish border, driven back into the territory of Belarus, and that this is a total disgrace, a violation of all international conventions. Now, obviously, these have become the mostly and many times quoted Western values of the rules-based order. In the middle of this crisis, President Steinmeier has nothing better to do than to receive opposition leader Tishanovskaya, who got 10% in the last election, but who is upheld as the winner by the EU. Foreign Minister Maas and the EU are calling for more sanctions, and they are meeting tomorrow to probably decide that, even if Lukashenko has said that he will not accept that and may cut off the energy flows through Belarus. There is a big debate right now in the EU if they should finance the construction of a fortified outer fence around the EU. So we are back to the dystopia of the book by Jean-Christophe Ruffin from 1991 that called The Empire and the New Barbarians, which discusses the idea of building a new limes around Europe, whereby Southwest Asia and Africa are incognita failed states with a few EU-financed refugee camps around, which already have called by Pope Francis to be compared with the concentration camps, and where Frontex is involved in pushback operations, where they clearly have discounted that many refugees die drowning or otherwise dying. So one should be absolutely clear. If you have a hyperinflationary blowout of the system, like that in Weimar Germany in 1923, but this time not in one country, but in all countries where there is no capital control. And if they implement the plans discussed in Glasgow about the Great Reset, you will get a migration of people, as we see increasingly trying to move from South and Central America into the United States and from the Near and Middle East and Africa into Europe. Not just some migrants, but Völkerwanderungen, migration of peoples, like in the ancient times. Concerning the larger strategic situation between the major powers, in trying to evaluate the confusingly contradictory statements coming from the Biden administration in respect to the relations of the United States to China and Russia, one day promising, the next day invalidated by provocative actions by the US around Taiwan or Ukraine or the Black Sea, one should not forget the remarks by the commander of the US Strategic Command, Admiral Charles Richard, who already in February of this year wrote in the magazine Proceedings, quote, "There is a real possibility that a regional crisis with Russia or China could escalate quickly to a conflict involving nuclear weapons. If they perceived a conventional loss would threaten the regime or state. Consequently, the US military must shift its principal assumption from nuclear employment is not possible to nuclear employment is a very real possibility." Now, this is a noteworthy statement. How likely is it that any of the two hottest potentials for regional crisis would be lost by Russia or China if it came to a conventional military action? Concerning a conventional attack on Russia, it would be wise for Admiral Richard to read Leo Tolstoy's War and Peace about the Napoleonic Wars, supplemented by the strategic studies by the brother-in-law of Friedrich Schiller, Ludwig von Wolzogen, who had designed the plan for the Prussian reformers and the Russian Tsar, how to lure Napoleon into the vastness of Russia, where he would be ruined by the logistical and material overextension. At the end of the Napoleonic campaign, the gigantic army of Napoleon was beaten down to a few miserable bunches of people, hardly making it back to the West. And it is well known that the architects of World War II had learned nothing from that precedent. And the Great Patriotic War is still very vivid in the minds of the Russian population. So the US and NATO forces for sure have studied what a conventional war against Russia is like, and that it is not an option at all. And recently, after some very misleading signals coming from the US concerning their support for a potential Taiwan independence, culminating in President Biden's so-called slip of the tongue that the US would come to the defense of Taiwan after an incursion from the mainland, the Chinese media was full with articles expressing confidence that the PLA would win any conventional war at ease. And indeed, how would any conventional force win against a highly motivated population of 1.4 billion people who are absolutely determined that the century of humiliation whereby foreign powers would invade their country and grab territories will never happen again, especially if the logistical backup for the other side is more than 7,000 miles away. Earlier this year, Daniel Ellsberg, at the occasion of the 50th anniversary of his revealing the Pentagon Papers, referred to a proposal by John Foster Dulles to launch a nuclear exchange with Russia and China in the Taiwan Strait, even at the cost of the total annihilation of Taiwan, just to keep the US position strategically. he cited a partially declassified study of the Rand Corporation from 1958 called the 1958 Taiwan Strait Crisis, a Documented History, a paper which should be recommended reading material for our contemporary citizens who are in danger once again to sleepwalk into a world war. He mooted the probability that a similar discussion, he meaning Ellsberg, that a similar discussion was going on today, and referred to the quote by Admiral Richard mentioned before, and then expressed his concern that without these discussions coming out in time, that civilization will not survive the era of nuclear weapons. Richard mentioned before, while there are off and on tiny signs of an improvement of the relationship between the US and Russia and China, such as the Biden-Putin summit recently, or the strategic talks in Geneva, or NATO General Secretary Stoltenberg saying China is not the enemy, it usually takes only a day or so until cold water is poured on that hope by some provocative action concerning Taiwan, Ukraine, or the present deployment of reconnaissance aircraft and US warship deployments in the Black Sea, which the Russian Defense Ministry spokesman, Major General Igor Konanchenko, warned that Russia regards as a study of the anticipated theater of war in case Ukraine prepares a power solution to the conflict in the southeast. Sometimes these actions are highly provocative and dangerous to the regional security and strategic stability. Sometimes, however, they are also ridiculous, like when our intrepid defense minister Annegret Kramp-Karrenbauer sends a frigate into the Indo-Pacific to show the flag. Maybe she hopes, and the West with her, that they will win by causing the Chinese people to laugh themselves to death. But the serious question is, can a war between the major powers be avoided? The real reason for all these tensions is the rise of China, a rise that cannot be stopped, because for the last 40 years, China has done things essentially right economically, alleviation of 850 million of its own citizens out of poverty, then through the Belt and Road Initiative, offering the Chinese model to the developing countries, who for the first time have the chance to overcome underdevelopment left by the colonial powers, and which continued by the IMF, the World Bank, and the neoliberal financial system. Since poverty and starvation are without dispute among the worst violations of human rights, China has done more for the protection of human rights than any other country on the planet. But it is exactly the crime the Western financial oligarchy is so upset about. If you read Klaus Schwab's latest book, Stakeholder Capitalism, he spills it all out. It is the fight against poverty and the desire to lead a decent life which, quote, destroys the planet. And therefore, it is poverty alleviation which has to be stopped if you want to save the planet. And since China is the main vehicle of that, China, according to this logic, is the enemy which has to be contained, and there needs to be a regime change of the CPC, as in the January threatened longer Telegram article in the Atlantic Council. So it is labeled a dictatorship, an autocratic regime, etc., etc. But the fact is that with a population of 1.4 billion people, China so far had only 4,600 deaths of COVID, as compared to 760,000 deaths in the United States with a population of 329.5 million people, and Germany 97,300 deaths and 83.9 24 million people. By the same token, the Kurt Schwabs of this world are the worst human rights offenders of all, and that is the nicest thing you can say about them. So rather than getting drawn into a conflict with Russia and China, which can only lead to the destruction of everybody, we should go back to the list of mistakes mentioned in the beginning and correct them. Given the enormity of the crisis, this must start with an emergency crash program for the salvation of Afghanistan and Haiti with a twofold approach. An immediate, dramatic humanitarian emergency program, food, medicine, fuel, energy, shelter. For this, all the monies belonging to the Afghan people must be released, and donor countries for both Afghanistan and Haiti must immediately resume adequate aid, and there must be a full international support for the integration of Afghanistan into the Belt and Road Initiative and a real reconstruction program for Haiti. All neighboring countries of Afghanistan, the Central Asian republics, Pakistan, Iran, India, Russia, and China, have a fundamental interest to save and stabilize Afghanistan. The US and NATO countries, which have conducted the war for 20 years and left the country in a catastrophic condition, have a moral obligation to contribute to both the immediate aid and the economic buildup of the country. It should be obvious, as Lyndon LaRouche insisted already in 1973 with his biological task force, that this and other pandemics already on the horizon will only be gotten under control if the terrible underdevelopment of large parts of the planet is overcome for good. This has now to be accomplished by starting with the construction of a modern health system in every single nation, with a top priority of Afghanistan and Haiti, but naturally also Yemen, Syria, and all the other countries in terrible need. For Afghanistan, we should call it Operation Ibn Sina. Ibn Sina, or Avicenna as he is called in the West, because this outstanding figure stands for the proudest tradition of this country. There are different historical sources who debate if only the father Abdullah was born in Balkh or also Ibn Sina. Balkh being in Afghanistan, other places named are either in Uzbekistan or in Persia, Iran. It doesn't matter. He is the son of the area of Bactrian, what used to be called the land of the thousand cities around the time of the ancient Greek civilization. Ibn Sina, who was born in 980 after Christ and died in 10,037, is recognized by everybody to be the father of modern medicine. He was also a philosopher, a geologist, an astronomer. He studied earthquakes and cloud formation. He developed methods of chemistry, such as how to make sulfur. He also was an accomplished poet and wrote dramas. But especially in medicine, he made absolutely revolutionary breakthroughs. For example, he identified the function of the different organs, the pulse, the connection between the nerves and the movement of the muscles. He discovered meningitis, breast cancer, jaundice, bladder stones. He made a whole catalog of medicines. He was the first who developed psychotherapy. He wrote a compendium about the soul, a treatise how about the cure of the soul can occur, the healing of doubt and despair. He wrote more than 200 books, maybe even double the amount, and his canon of medicine was the standard works for physicians in Europe until the 17th and in some cases even the 19th century. Ibn Sina also developed a comprehensive metaphysical conception in the tradition of Plato Al-Farabi, Al-Kindi, he developed the extremely important conception of the necessary existence, the Wahib al-Wujud, pardon my pronunciation, which is Arabic for God. All the other existences only exist according to this necessary existence concept because God makes them possible. This idea of Ibn Sina influenced many thinkers in all kinds of different religions. He was also highly regarded among many others by Dante, who mentioned him in the Convivio and the Divine Comedy, as well as Nicolaus von Kues, and in several texts, such as his defense of the Docta Ignorentiae against Professor Wenck and his criticisms. Cusa writes, before Avicenna, the divine Plato in the Parmenides made a very acute effort to open the road to God, because every image does not reach the truth of its exemplar. So Afghanistan needs urgently a modern hospitals, which could be built in 2 weeks, as the Chinese have proven in Wuhan. And they need modern educated doctors. Many Afghani doctors are right now in Europe or in the United States, educated nurses. And what better way than to give the effort to pull this together the name of Ibn Sina, to recall the tradition of one of the greatest thinkers of all of universal history. Avicenna is at the same time the connection between the humanist tradition of all European and Islamic nations, because of all the ideas of the ancient Greek philosophy which contributed to his work, which he in turn had then a major influence on him. And he again influenced then many thinkers in many countries. So let's make the effort to get the international aid and forces together to build a modern health system on an emergency basis in his name. And by committing ourselves to that, we in the West may also regain the integrity and the moral stature which we need to get out of this crisis. And let us call up all the great thinkers and philosophers of our traditions to join together in this effort. Operation Ibn Sina must also become the seed crystal for the cooperation between Russia, China, the US, and European nations in the effort to save Afghanistan. And if we can overcome the geopolitical thinking in this joint mission, then this can be one of the urgently needed confidence-building steps to create a new model of international relations on the strategic level. To address and solve all the problems of biblical dimensions, as David Beasley of the World Food Programme calls them, the world famine, the pandemic, the migrant crisis, poverty and underdevelopment of billions of people, the cooperation with the Belt and Road Initiative is the only practical and already available framework for solutions. So rather than proposing the pompous global gateway, which Ursula von der Leyen intends to make public in the next days during her visit to Washington, which Handelsblatt characterizes as way below expectations without listing concrete projects or priorities and as a lost occasion, European nations and the United States should accept the win-win cooperation for a shared community of a joint future President Xi Jinping has been talking about. Let me make one final point. To overcome this multifaceted, unprecedented crisis, we not only need a completely new paradigm in international relations, an unprejudiced study of what China does economically right and why the West was unable or unwilling to develop the so-called developing sector. there needs above all to be a serious study how it was possible for my late husband Lyndon LaRouche to forecast all aspects of the present crisis, which he presciently dated back to the 1964 to 1972 cultural paradigm shift, where a new age counterculture was introduced, and of which he warned in numerous articles, among them from 1998, How to Think in a Time of Crisis, that unless this paradigm was reversed, it would threaten the existence of the global civilization. In these articles, he identified the introduction of various forms of cultural relativism of the T groups and the Rainbow Coalition as the division of everyone from everyone, according every discoverable distinction of ethnic origin, gender, or what have you, as that principle of everything is allowed which would destroy society from within. Think of the video clip we saw at the beginning of my remarks, of the Dionysian mob, which indeed could cause the suspicion that body snatchers from outer space have taken over the minds of these youths, which still may have the bodies of humans, but whose brains clearly are not of this species. It is therefore a challenge for all serious scientists around the world to investigate why Lyndon LaRouche was so absolutely accurate in forecasting the timing and character of the present worldwide financial, monetary, and economic breakdown crisis, as well as his method of physical economy if we want to develop our planet to be livable for all human beings and living in the future. In this spirit, let's act on the joyous assumption that we are the uniquely creative species in the universe, that we are not Earthlings, but the potentially immortal species in the universe. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Helga. And if you've just joined us, we want to welcome you all to the first panel of the morning session of this conference of the International Schiller Institute. All moral resources of humanity have to be called up. Mankind must be the immortal species. We want to invite all of you to join the Schiller Institute. After all, if we're saying that all moral resources of humanity are supposed to be called up, that would include you. And we'd like to start with you. So please become a member. You can do so by following the link that you're seeing on the screen. And we welcome you into our ranks. For our next presentation, we will hear from Ms. Chen Xiaohan, Deputy Secretary General of the Chinese Association for Peace and Disarmament. Her topic is Major Country Relations and Global Development.
Dear President Helga, ladies and gentlemen, friends, good afternoon. I'm Chen Xiaohan, Deputy Secretary General of the Chinese People's Association for Peace and Disarmament. As representative of our association, I feel much honored to attend this webinar. At present, centenary changes and the pandemic are intertwined and overlaid. Competition between major countries is becoming more tense. The deficit of global governance is being acute. Regional hotspot issues keep flaring up. The new military revolution is developing by leaps and bounds, and the traditional and non-traditional security issues are interweaved. The whole world has entered a period of turbulence and change. Meanwhile, the COVID-19 pandemic has deepened the understanding of countries in the world that they are in the same boat and stand together for weal and woe. The new situation brings new opportunities as well as challenges. All countries, particularly the major countries, need to strengthen coordination and cooperation, prevent major security risks together, and actively promote reshaping the international security order, thus realizing everlasting peace and prosperity. China and Europe as two major forces, markets, and civilizations in the world, need to fulfill our responsibilities and work together to promote multipolarization of the world, economic globalization, and democratization of international relations, so as to provide more stability and positive energy to the turbulent and changing world. China-Europe relations, with solid public support, broad common interests, and similar strategic aspirations, have stood the test of decades. China and Europe should stick to the directions of dialogue and cooperation, promote mutual trust, and manage differences, should collect development strategies, jointly boost economic recovery, and continuously deepen cooperation in all areas, should earnestly advance the building of partnership for peace, growth, reform, and civilization, should safeguard genuine multilateralism and encourage international community to work together to address common challenges such as large-scale epidemics, climate change, and biodiversity conservation. Also, I noted not long ago, President Helga, in your interview with CGTN, specifically talked about your understanding of China's whole process of people's democracy, which I appreciate. Hereby, I'd like to add a few words. As President Xi Jinping has stressed that democracy is not for decoration, nor for displaying, but for solving problems that people need to solve. Democracy is the right of all peoples, not the monopoly of a few nations. Whether a country is democratic or not should be judged by its own people, not by the finger pointing of a few outsiders, should be judged by the international community, not by a self-righteous few. There are many ways to realize democracy, and there cannot be cookie-cutter approach. It is undemocratical to measure the colorful political system of the world with a single yardstick and examine the colorful political civilizations of mankind with monotonous eyes. The whole process of people's democracy in China are rooted in the Chinese national conditions, not only has a complete system, but also has a full participation in practice. Therefore, it has realized the process of democracy and the result of democracy, pure democracy and substantial democracy, direct democracy and indirect democracy, the unity of people's democracy and national will. It is a full chain, all directional and all encompassing democracy has won sincere support by the entire Chinese people and contributed to Chinese experience and wisdom to the world political system and to human political civilization. Due to the limited time, I cannot further elaborate China's democratical system, but just want to give two examples. One is, when formulating the 14th five-year plan, the Chinese government paid close attention to soliciting opinions from all aspects of our society. More than 1 million opinions and suggestions were collected online. The other is, I myself have just voted in the election of deputies to the People's Congress of Haidian District, Beijing, fulfilling my scared deputy under the Constitution and electing the deputy I supported. Dear friends, China is committed to the well-being of all of the Chinese people and hopes that all other people in the world will live a better life. The developing countries are faced with multiple political, economic, social, and livelihood crises, posing severe challenges to the implementation of the 2030 Agenda and sustainable development. Meanwhile, as the Industrial Revolution continues to gather momentum, the digital economy, green development, and new forms of business and models brought about by the pandemic have created new opportunities for developing countries to achieve leapfrog development. Under such era background, our President Xi Jinping put forward the Global Development Initiative at the general debate of the 76th session of the UN General Assembly, which called for adherence to the concept of putting development first and people first, and put forward proposals and plans for cooperation in 8 key areas, including poverty reduction, food security, anti-epidemic, and vaccine efforts, financing for development, climate change, and green development, industrialization, digital economy, and collectivity. We call for a more equal and balanced global development partnership to provide new impetus for developing countries to accelerate development. The international community should advocate genuine multilateralism and work together to address global risks and challenges such as COVID-19 and climate change. Ladies and gentlemen, friends, our association attaches great importance to peace, publicity, and security research and has put not limited to the commemoration of the International Day of Peace, online dialogue between China and US scholars, China and Europe scholars, and other joint activities, conducting in-depth exchanges on international strategic security, regional security, global security governance, arms control, disarmament, and non-proliferation. Once again, I'd like to thank President Helga. You are our old friends and Schiller Institute for this well-organized webinar. We hope to consolidate the exchanges with the Schiller Institute and to promote communications with all participants, thus making our joint efforts for world peace and stability and the well-being of mankind as well. Thank you.
That was Ms. Chen Xiaohan, Deputy Secretary General of the Chinese Association for Peace and Disarmament. Our next speaker is Ambassador Anna Evstenieva, Deputy Permanent Representative of the Russian Federation Mission to the United Nations, and her topic is the situation in Afghanistan after foreign troops withdrawal. Welcome.
Thank you very much for inviting me again for this event, and it's always a pleasure and honor to participate in conferences and webinars of Schiller Institute, an old friend of our country, and this topic is very important for us, the one that you have in the title of today's meeting, can a strategic crisis between the major powers be avoided? And due to the files that I'm dealing with in the UN Security Council here in New York as a Russian delegate, and also bearing in mind how important the situation in Afghanistan is for the region and for the state of affairs among major powers, I will concentrate on it. Actually, I already spoke in one of your events in summer about Afghanistan, and since I last spoke here, the situation changed dramatically, and Afghanistan has gone through a major and very rapid transformation, with ex-President Ghani fleeing the country, government collapsing, and the Taliban coming into power in the middle of August. After 20 years of presence, the U.S., along with its allies, have finally left the country in the end of that month. And as we speak, the situation, the reality on the ground has become brand new. And no one has ever expected the situation go this way, and especially the return of the Taliban after their defeat was so rapid and unexpected for everyone. But however, this is an objective reality. The members of the entire international community have to deal this way or another. And we saw that very well here in the UN and the Security Council. And you also could see it in the media with the reports from the capitals that almost no one was prepared, including in Washington, and this confusion with regards what to do was so apparent. And actually, I'm not sure if we if we already passed this stage and there is more clarity on the ground in this regard, and in major capitals and also in Afghanistan. But what was eventually more important, in my view, that the Taliban that seized power was also not prepared to deal with the challenges the country faces. On one side, it's clearly a window of opportunities for them to open a new chapter in the history and rejoin the international community as a peaceful and responsible state. But at the same time, it's clear that they are not capable to address the problems in the country by themselves. And there is unfortunately no unity in Afghanistan, no peace. Terrorists are on the rise, and there is absolutely no money to meet the needs of ordinary people. Of course, the new Afghan authorities, despite the way they came to power, they're now sending positive signals regarding their intention to restore the order, to establish inclusive government, to fight against terrorism and drug trafficking. And they are demonstrating their willingness and readiness to improve cooperation with regional countries and broader international community, including key donors. But however, we shouldn't be naive. It's the Taliban. And it's still the Taliban, and the one that we knew for years. And as we mentioned in different forums, and what people are talking about all over the world, that the new authorities in Afghanistan should meet the commitments they themselves made, and these commitments should be supplemented with actions and deeds. And in this sense, there is not much difference with regards to what we hear from our partners. And this is the message that the Taliban should meet the commitments, is that we hear from the US, from European Union, from China, from regional countries. And of course, that's what we are saying as well. But it's crystal clear that in the end, the stability in Afghanistan is in the interest of all. One of the major challenges for the stability in the country is terrorism, and it becomes more apparent recently. The activities of ISIL are of particular concern, and recent terrorist attacks have become despicable acts of terror. And it's clear that that ISIL is trying to demonstrate its power and influence in the country, and how it can influence and deepen the ethnic divisions and religious divisions in this poor country. Also, it becomes a great concern for us, because we are close, our Central Asian partners are close, and there is a risk of spillover in the region. Drug production comes hand in hand here, because it's one of the main financial sources for terrorist activities, and it should be stopped. Apart from that, Afghanistan has also faced huge corruption, economic and financial dependence, human rights challenges, and other problems. And it's clear that the country used to live thanks to financial injections from the outside. Now this flow of money is almost completely drained. There is no budget, no money for basic services, no salaries for police, teachers, doctors. And the humanitarian assistance, though it has scaled up, it's not able to solve the matter in sustainable way as just a short-term patch. However, it's very important to stress that these are long-standing challenges and threats in Afghanistan. They have existed in the countries for years, and there is a clear understanding now that these problems were simply ignored during all these years of international presence. And despite of it, we don't see any self-reliant economy or self-reliant state in Afghanistan. And if international community doesn't react accordingly to the situation and do it quickly, Afghanistan will continue to slide into abyss. And what is also very dangerous, that it may take the region with it. Despite the relative unity of judgments with regards to the situation in Afghanistan, as I said before, there are different nuances here, and there are nuances in terms of messaging to the Taliban. And they're among different actors. And there is definitely a deep mistrust to the Taliban and even more distrust between major players. Let alone we know that all of them try to do their best to secure geopolitical interests that go beyond Afghanistan and stability in the region. But we are still working in Troika, in extended Troika, and I talked about it last time in summer, and that's a very important part of our position in Afghanistan, that this is the format that comprises Russia, US, China, and Pakistan. It's the most relevant format now for decision making, especially in the political field. But it definitely should be complemented with a more broader format, which we also have, the Moscow format that encompasses regional players and also representatives of Taliban. So recently, about a month ago, there was a meeting of Moscow format, and it confirmed that it's a unique platform for all regional players and Afghan political leaders to discuss the challenges and acute problems in the country, in the region. But on behalf of the Western partners, I must say, so far we hear the recipe, which is old and well known. Exercise pressure. The more, the better. Keep sanctions, blackmail with humanitarian and economic assistance. And it's the rhetoric we hear from those who left the country so irresponsibly and so abruptly. And in our view, it's clear that any attempts to dictate and manipulate can hardly influence the situation, because the Talibs got used to live under restrictions. But what we have to do is to address the aspirations of the people in terms of having a functioning state, and actually get aid, food, salaries, education, and all that kind of things. And so, in our view, we have to be pragmatic, and that we were talking about it before, and it's very consistent on behalf of Russia. We shouldn't do the same mistakes, and we call for our Western partners, as we say in Russia, don't walk the rake, because it will hit your head again and again. And the democratization plans failed in Afghanistan, as they did in many other parts of the world. So probably it's time to alter the old recipe. And as Helga said earlier, it's fundamental that we have humanitarian aid now, that the acute problems solved without any delays. So it's something that UN shares and tries to help with scaling up humanitarian assistance. There is a sanction regime that is an impediment for scaling up humanitarian assistance. We are not talking about lifting sanctions or altering them or review them in any short time perspective, but it's important to make decisions on exemptions that will allow economic operators and humanitarian agencies to work better on the ground. It's fundamental that the decisions are taken to unfreeze the assets, because, as I said earlier, humanitarian assistance is just a patch. So money should flow to the country, and so that the salaries could be paid at this time, despite the fact that many people are working for the government, and for Americans it's a major impediment. Teachers, doctors, basic people working for basic services should get their money. Otherwise, it's very dangerous for the collapse of the country and more people fleeing the country. It's important that we do our best to preserve well-educated population, people who represent, so to say, intelligentsia of Afghanistan, those who haven't left already, because without this, it will be difficult to talk about stable Afghanistan. So I know that there are efforts on behalf of the United States to solve these issues. It's very sad that it's in terms of World Bank money and unfreezing assets, it's completely in their hands. But there is a hope that they understand that the risks that that not moving quickly will entail. But there is a space for cooperation, and if we overcome mistrust, at least for some extent, if people do not get entrenched in their requests to talibs and taking a pragmatic stance and cooperate with a spirit of cooperation, I think we can turn the tide and make things better. But we have to move quickly and in a good faith. And I thank you very much once again for inviting me. And I hope and I wish all the best to Schiller Institute, and we'll be ready to answer the questions later on. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. We've just heard from the presentation of Ambassador Anna Evgenyeva, the Deputy Permanent Representative of the Russian Federation to the United Nations. And now we are going to, and we should just say, if you've just joined us, that we welcome you to today's International Schiller Institute Conference. All moral resources of humanity have to be called up. Mankind must be the immortal species. This morning panel is, can a strategic crisis between the major powers be avoided? And our next speaker is Dr. Andrey Cartunov, the Director General of the Russian International Affairs Council. And his topic is there a pathway for an improved relationship between the United States and Russia? Welcome.
Thank you, Dennis. It is definitely my honor and my pleasure to be a part of this conference, and specifically to be a part of this panel. A lot has been said here already, and I think that my major contribution to the discussion is that I would bring some gender diversity into otherwise completely female panel. So let me try to share with you some of my views on the current state of the bilateral relations between the United States and the Russian Federation. Where do we go? But before doing that, I will take the liberty to get back to the legacy of Friedrich Schiller, since it's a Friedrich Schiller Institute and Friedrich Schiller Conference. I think it would be appropriate to remind of the wisdom of the great German thinker. We usually recall Schiller as a poet and as a writer, but he was clearly more than that. He was a visionary. He was a philosopher. He was a teacher and an educator, and he wrote a couple of serious books on enlightenment and on education. I would like to get back to one of them, which is called On the Aesthetic Education of Man. And I don't recall the exact quote, but I do remember the sense of his message. He wrote, live with your century, but do not be its creature. Work for your contemporaries, but create what they need, not what they praise. And I think that this is a very important message, which is very relevant to the situation that we face today in the international relations. Leaders, political leaders of today, usually try to provide to their constituencies what these constituencies want, rather than what these constituencies really need. Leaders try to follow opinion polls. They try to reflect the fluctuations in the public moods. And I wonder whether we can really call that a leadership. A leader should be in a position to make steps that are perceived unpopular, risky, and steps that many would oppose. If you want to lead, sometimes you have to turn back to your constituency. You should be in front of the constituency, not follow the constituency. And I think that this is something that we should remember when we talk about the current US policies, including the US policy towards the Russian Federation. We're approaching a small anniversary, 6 years since President Biden and President Putin met in Geneva. That was in the middle of June of this year, and many people hoped that probably this meeting would mark a turning point in the relationship. Maybe the two sides started to move away from the crisis, away from this very difficult relationship that they had for at least a couple of years. And indeed, one could argue that there were some positive changes in the relationship over the last 6 months. Most importantly, we now have resumed arms control negotiations between Russia and the United States, and it's an uphill battle for the two sides. There are very different approaches on how we should proceed beyond the New START agreement. Russia insists on talking about strategic weapons at large, both nuclear and non-nuclear, while the United States would prefer to focus on nuclear weapons, strategic and non-strategic. But anyway, this dialogue is on, and hopefully it will bring some fruits before the New START agreement expires. We also have more general conversation with the United States on strategic stability. Again, this is not an easy dialogue. I think that the starting positions are very different, and it is quite a challenge to reconcile different perceptions on strategic stability. Nevertheless, I think it's already quite important that this dialogue goes on, and let us hope that it will be productive and it will lead to some common strategic culture of the 21st century. Finally, the last but definitely not the least, I'd like to emphasize the importance of the US-Russian dialogue on cybersecurity. Many people were very pessimistic about this initiative. They thought that it would fail shortly after it has been launched. But it seems that the dialogue goes on, and it seems that it is not hopeless. However, having said that, I think I would be wrong to argue that there was a breakthrough relationship, and that relationship has changed dramatically for the better. Unfortunately, this is not the case. We see the diplomatic war between Russia and the the United States going on, and there are fewer and fewer diplomats left in the Russian embassy in Washington and in the US embassy in Moscow. We definitely have a fierce information war between the two states, and just recently the United States has accused Russia of mounting troops on the Ukrainian border, which Moscow flatly denies. And incidentally, at this particular juncture, Ukraine also denies, these accusations of the United States. We have more and more sanctions imposed by the United States on Russia. And quite divergent positions on many regional issues. So one can say that the glass is half full or it is half empty. I think that the last 6 months demonstrated that no reset is possible, no detente is likely to take place anytime soon, primarily because the two sides have fundamentally different views on the world, on the international system, on what is fair and what is not, what is legitimate and what is not in international relations. Nevertheless, I think that even under current quite challenging circumstances, there are opportunities of moving ahead. And though the United States will continue to pursue its dual containment policy targeted against both China and Russia, I think both China and Russia have opportunities to look for some arrangements with the United States on specific issues. One of good examples that I would like to single out is the agreement of all three major powers to extend the 2020 United Nations Security Council resolution on humanitarian corridors in Syria. I think it was an important decision, and it allowed to avoid a conflict and arguably a humanitarian disaster in the province of Idlib. If we were able to agree on Syria, I think we could probably agree on Afghanistan, though I fully subscribe to what has been said by Deputy head of the Russian delegation to the United Nations. Unfortunately, the positions on Afghanistan are still very far apart from each other, and to reconcile these positions would be quite a daunting and important task. But I do believe that we can continue working with the United States on specific regional matters. Afghanistan is one of them. But we can talk about the Iranian nuclear portfolio, we can talk about the Arctic region, we can talk about North Korea, and definitely this is something where Russia, the United States, and China might find, if not common interests, at least overlapping interests. The next couple of months will be critical. And they will show us whether we can work together on the issues of global commons like nuclear non-proliferation and climate change. And also, I think that it's not too late to start some kind of fruitful cooperation on the COVID-19 pandemic, at least in terms of mutual recognition of vaccines, and assisting the Global South with the production and distribution of vaccines to the poorest population. So it is doable. However, it will not change the primarily adversarial nature of the US-Russian relations. I think that these relations will continue to be quite tense in years to come. And I do not foresee a dramatic change in this relationship, at least until 2024, when we might observe a generational change in the US politics with different people coming to the White House and also to the Capitol Hill. Let me conclude my short presentation with getting back to Friedrich Schiller, I think it is critically important for contemporary leaders to go beyond their day-to-day institutional interests, beyond their immediate constituencies of stakeholders, and to think not in terms of narrowly defined national interests of their respective countries, but rather in terms of global commons. I understand that that might sound naive and not very practical, but that's the only way we can assure the survivability of our species. Otherwise, I'm afraid we're moving in the direction of an epic disaster with unpredictable consequences. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Andrey. We just heard from Dr. Andrey Kortunov, the Director General of the Russian International Affairs Council. And we're now going to go to a discussion period among the panelists, and we want to then resume our discussion. We also, I think, have two questioners, Errol Rasmussen and Dr. Nikolai Megitz. We're just sort of giving the questioners also notice that we will be going to them, but after we first hear from our panelists. So if we can bring everybody up on the screen, okay, we have Helga, we have Andrey, and we have Ambassador Evstigneeva. So Helga, you want to make any comments on anything you've heard so far?
First of all, I want to thank the two speakers who are with me here on this panel. I'm very happy to, hear what both of you have to say, and naturally, especially Mr. Kortunov talking about Friedrich Schiller, which I think is very important, because if you don't have a vision where you want to go, you get and the quote you mentioned is one of my most favorite quotes, which is sort of one of my life mottos, that and Schiller even said you have to despise the opinion of your contemporaries when they are wrong. And I think that's a very healthy attitude, because it makes you it liberates you and helps you to pursue what you know is right. I understand that, naturally, from the standpoint of Russia being one of the major powers affected, for good or for bad, by the developments in Afghanistan, that you would have the pragmatic view you expressed, also, Mrs. Ambassador, what you said. But still, I think this is not a static situation. This can go either completely wrong and turn the region into chaos for, all the neighbors, being affected, or it can be the beginning of a new cooperation. And I think the drama of the situation and the fact that all these things will get worse by the hyperinflation effect on food prices, on fuel, on, this is going to be sort of the revolver on the head of the humankind. Are we capable of changing our views when we can avoid a humanitarian crisis where literally many millions of people could die this winter? And the reason why I mentioned Ibn Sina as a sort of a name of an icon of the effort is because you have to evoke, and that's also Schiller's idea, you have to evoke the best in people. And, that hopefully will encourage all the participants, the Afghani diaspora, the, people who are concerned about the crisis, to, act and change the dynamic. I don't think pragmatism alone is enough. So that's what I want to say.
Okay. Ambassador Evstigneeva, any thoughts that you'd like to express?
Thank you for giving me the floor again, and I wanted to echo things that were said by my colleague Andrey with regards to Russian-American relations at this stage, and the importance of them for the world, and I see it quite well in the Security Council. where we have to deal not with bilateral relations, but trying to resolve the crises all over the world, and the situations that are discussed in the Security Council. Most of them are very dire and difficult and very complex. But still, I must say, actually, what we are doing in the Security Council is trying to resolve them, and to help the people to get stability and to find ways to overcome the conflicts and crises. And for us, it's fundamental to find solutions, to agree. So we cannot allow ourselves to resort to zero-sum game, but unfortunately, it's very often the case. Frankly speaking, dealing with Sudan or Mali or Central African Republic or Afghanistan or Syria or Haiti, well, the diplomats and people working on these situations, they usually know where the problem lies and what are the root causes of situations, and how can they be resolved in the end, if it's their power sharing or resolving some particular issues or something else. And UN possesses the instruments that could help. It's peacekeeping operations, special political missions, mediation support, and etc. So we do have instruments in our hands, but it's so often get stuck into two major things that come to my mind. The first one is that sometimes the political views of our Western countries do not allow them to act pragmatically. So there are things that they push forward without any reference to the realities in a particular country. So the recipes prescribed are the same for every situation. I will give you just one example. So every time I come to the Security Council to discuss some issues, I hear elections. So you have to have elections. Nobody questions the democratic, necessity to hear the voice of people. But in many cases, it's so irrelevant to push for the conduct of elections. And it will not resolve in most the issues, and it in most cases leads to another crisis when they are not prepared, when there is no social agreement on the share of power. But the Security Council, I call it a parroting, call for it. It happens in Somalia and Sudan and Afghanistan. The elections that were conducted there, what did they lead to? Was it a democracy? Did it lead to any kind of solutions in this country? No. But we still talk about the Scandinavian type of human rights imposed, the elections, and different types of these recipes. And so we hear a lot of mentoring here. And the second thing, which is very detrimental, is the atmosphere in relations between U.S. and Russia, U.S. and China, and the inability of Americans and their unwillingness to admit that in many cases the U.S. dominance is not relevant anymore. Afghanistan is a good example that the complete failure there is not admitted fully, and it also happens with France in many countries in Africa, when they are losing their grip, but they still not able to admit the new realities in these countries, and this affects our discussions in the Security Council as well. When in the end, without trying to solve the real issues, having instruments at hand, we end up in zero-sum game on many issues. And I see my also goal and my path here in New York, just try to make these steps to overcome this thing of a zero-sum game in order to find solutions, maybe tiny, maybe small steps, like the one that was mentioned on Syria cross-border mechanism. So every piece of a puzzle matters, and I really hope that our partners can do the same. Thank you.
Sure. Before we go to our first question, just want to ask Andrey if he had anything else that he'd like to say at this point.
Well, thank you. Actually, since the issue of Afghanistan was raised, let me make my 5-cent contribution to the discussion. And I have to report to you just this week, I had a meeting at my office with the EU High Commissioner Envoy to Afghanistan, Thomas Nicholson, and we discussed whether it is possible to come up with the integrated position on the preconditions for the new authorities' recognition in Afghanistan. He shared with me the EU position on Afghanistan, and if you go through the list of the terms on which the European Union might consider formal recognition of the new government in Afghanistan, I think that we can agree with most of what is listed there. Basically, it's first about safe, secure, and orderly departure of all foreign nationals and Afghans who wish to leave the country. And I know that Russia has a footnote to this provision, but this is not completely against what Russia believes to be appropriate. Second, it's about promoting, protecting, and respecting all human rights, in particular the full enjoyment of rights of women and girls, as well as children and persons belonging to minorities. Of course, that refers to religious minorities and ethnic minorities as well. It's the provision that Taliban should allow the implementation of humanitarian operations in Afghanistan in line with the general principles of humanity, neutrality, and independence, with full respect of international humanitarian law. Then it's about preventing Afghanistan from becoming a base for hosting, financing, and exporting terrorism to other countries. And finally, of course, it's about the inclusive and representative government through negotiations. So I think that what we can do right now, and by we, I mean independent think tanks and expert networks, we should work on this list to specify these terms, and hopefully even we could turn these general terms into some kind of roadmaps. If we are able to put together a coalition, I think we can pass our findings to Ambassador Yevstygnieva and to her colleagues in New York, and maybe they could turn some of our ideas into another UN Security Council resolution. Because I fully agree with Helga. Winter is approaching. It's not just about food, it's about fuel. It's about basic medicines. I think that urban areas in Afghanistan already suffer a lot, and they will suffer more when it gets colder. And we need to do something. We need to do something really fast. And I suggest that we should start working without any further delay. Thank you.
All right, very good. I know that Ambassador Yevstygnieva has some limitations on her schedule. We're going to try, I guess, to get one question in. But if she has to go, I just want to mention, from my own standpoint, you might try engaging some of your American colleagues in some reading, some good literature, good Russian literature. I would suggest, too, novels, the Alexander Herzen's Who is to Blame and Chernyshevsky's What is to be Done. And maybe if we can get them to concentrate on the second a little bit more than the first, we might get a little bit more progress in our relations in general. Can we go to Errol Rasmussen, who I think we have? Okay. Hi, Earl, is that you? And you are, right, the head of the Eurasia Center, so go right ahead.
I'm a vice president at Eurasia Center. So this is kind of a broad question, but let me kind of try to free focus it. I mean, I think we all know that I want to thank all the speakers. I agree with all their perceptions and their perspectives, and I think it's very critical. We're just in a tense environment. Right now, we're faced with multiple different tense situations going on. You've got the migrant crisis, which is continuing, and now Europe seeing more along the Belarus border. But a lot of that is as a result of Western policies, whether that's the Middle East, whether that's Afghanistan. Additionally, we've got the issues within. We've got the energy crisis going on, and which also leads back to some policies that the European Union made themselves. And we've got other very tense situations, Ukraine, Syria, South China Sea, Taiwan. And at the same time, I don't know what positive steps are being made. Very positive on the news on Afghanistan. But we've got a lot of rhetoric. We've got the sanction diplomacy occurring as normal. What seems like in a very tense situation. Let's just pick one: the Polish Belaruses in that area there. What steps can we take to kind of step back? Because it seems like an accident could easily occur, which could blow up quite easily.
Okay. So, Ambassador, could you want to take that first?
Well, probably Andrey can pick it up first if he wishes to.
Okay.
He's on strategic issues.
Okay.
Yeah, sure. Well, first of all, I think that specifically on the Belarus-Polish crisis, it is important the two sides to establish direct communications. I understand that Poles do not want to talk to Alexander Lukashenko. They do not recognize Lukashenko as the legitimate president of Belarus. But this crisis cannot be resolved if Belarusian authorities are not directly engaged. And this is clear. Second, I think that we should somehow separate this specific situation from adjacent complications and crises. For example, in the West, they tried to link this crisis and the military exercises that Russia conducts with Belarus now, or with the alleged concentration of Russian troops on the border with Ukraine. First of all, this concentration has never been confirmed even by the Ukrainian side. But second, I don't think that we should put everything into the same basket, because there are various issues, including the gas export of Russia to Europe and the recent breakdown of communication lines between NATO and Russia. We should take one piece after another. And finally, speaking of the migration crisis, I think that we should start thinking about continental migration strategy. Unfortunately, cooperation in migration management has never been strong between Europe and, let us say, Eurasia. But the reality is that you cannot separate one part of the continent from the other part of the continent. We need to have mechanisms to exchange statistics, to exchange best practices and failures on migration, to exchange information on readmissions, and many other issues which, in my view, can be separated from political disagreements. Migrations are likely to become more and more important, and we spoke about Afghanistan. If and when they open borders, I can foresee a major flow of from Afghanistan to Pakistan to Turkey and arguably further to Europe. We should be ready to see a new wave of migrations rising, and that calls for more cooperation, not only between donor countries, but also between recipient countries.
All right. Any further comments, or we let that stand? Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, right. In my view, it's much about the responsible decision making on behalf of Europeans in this case. So it's so evident now that some decisions are taken in European capitals and in Brussels, and that are not that are made on the basis of some political sentiments, anti-Russian, anti-Belarusian, anti-whoever. But in the end, these countries were not thinking about what it can lead to. And frankly speaking, I thought that the situation with Ukraine, what happened in 2014, should have taught Europeans that that following the American line on making these reckless decisions, as it happened in 2014 with the change of power in Kiev, leads to consequences, and I hope that it would teach them in the situation with Belarus as well. But what we see is that it's not the case, and Poland and other European countries on the other side of the border and our Baltic colleagues should understand that if they do something, so it will lead to consequences, and nobody knows or how it can backfire on them, including on migration and what they say about human rights, about their attitude towards people. So they have to see that there are two sides of this coin, and it can backfire at their border and closer than they thought. And so this understanding of the consequences and the responsible politics to their neighbors, bearing in mind their interests, is fundamental. And it's also related to the energy crisis in Europe. And we have a lot of discussions on the climate change and how it's related to peace and security, what could be done to mitigate the effects of climate change. But here as well, the decisions should be responsible. So other countries like China and Russia could be accused of being opportunistic here, but it's making decisions that might lead to energy crisis is not something they should have pursued. And a lot here was also dependent on the decision taken in European Union about changing the sources of energy supply, and also how they communicated and treated Russia in the past. And as you know, we are very tolerant people, and our president and our leadership has always underlined that the cooperation and hearing each other and taking into consideration mutual interests is fundamental, and that's how we can deal with it. But this is the bumpy road. That's clear. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Helga, I realize you may have some thoughts about this, and I also want to put something in at this point, because we just got a question in which will be relevant for you, Helga. This is from Edward Lazansky, Dr. Edward Lazansky, the president and founder of the American University in Moscow. And his question is, taking into account this most dangerous situation, is there any way to poll the American people about their attitude toward the current U.S. policy toward Russia? So I just wanted to put that in, Helga, because he had that as a specific matter he wanted to ask you.
Yeah, I want to also comment on what was said previously, including by Mr. Rasmussen, the question he asked. I mean, the conceptual problem is, unfortunately, our Chinese speaker is not able to participate in the discussion because of the 12-hour time difference, and it's sort of, too late. But she made emphatically the point, which is Chinese policy, in general, to alleviate poverty as being one of the primary policy goals of China. And I think that goes also for Russia and some other countries. But that poverty alleviation is being regarded by certain people in the West, I mentioned Kurt Schwab, as that which destroys the planet because it supposedly impacts the climate and therefore must be stopped. Now, the EU Commission, von der Leyen in particular, are pushing the Green Deal, which explicitly is based on the policy of shifting the trillions, going completely out of fossil fuels, but also related industries, which will lead to a lowering of the energy flux density in the production process, and therefore will give room for much, much less people to survive. And that is a conflict which I think we cannot talk around, because, if you regard poverty alleviation as an aim, which I think, human life is the most precious we have because of the creative potential of every single human being, or you regard the climate as so much more important that you're willing to sacrifice industrial nations and, entire continents, I think that is a conflict we do not get around to not discuss. And we have the panels tomorrow also, where we have a lot of scientists from around the world who debate the question that the IPCC thesis about climate change is the only valid explanation for the changes in the climate. So I think that is a very important point. The other point is that, what I try to come to in my initial remarks is we are in a hyperinflationary breakdown crisis. And I do not think that the argument by the Federal Reserve that the hyperinflation will be temporary is very credible. I think we are in a collapse phase where the prices of energy, food, and all kinds of other basic commodities will go up. This will worsen the crisis in the developing countries. The migration problem will get worse. And therefore, I think what is urgently needed is a contingency plan, how to address the whole situation. And I think, the Belt and Road Initiative and the development plans, which the Schiller Institute has worked out for decades, which we collected in the book, The New Silk Road Becomes the World Land Bridge, that is sort of a blueprint of overcoming the underdevelopment in the developing countries. And I don't think we will solve all of these problems if we do not change our attitude and say the overcoming of underdevelopment in large parts of the planet is a primary task which needs to be solved. It's morally, economically, and for many other reasons an absolute must. So this is what I would like to put on the table, and I would hope that countries like Russia and China and other major countries, the United States, could go back to their tradition of Franklin D. Roosevelt and the real New Deal, not this fake New Deal which they now talk about, and make a contingency plan, because this crisis will come and it will put itself on the agenda with a big bang. That is my conviction. And then the countries who can act must have a plan of what to do.
All right. So we have, I think, one final question which is from Dr. Nikolai Megitz. Okay, okay, sir, go right ahead. You are from the Institute of Eastern Europe and Central Asia, is that correct?
Yes, that's correct. And I'm also professor at the Webster University, St. Louis, Missouri, teaching their international business. Anyway, thank you for a very interesting presentation. I learned quite a lot from each presenters, and I may pose a little bit different opinion and a different view on what was discussed today. But first of all, I would like to admire Dr. Kortunov for his open-minded presentation. Okay, I feel from his presentation like he is open, despite that he represents the official government view on situation in Eastern European region, specifically where I focus on my research. But at least he proposed some suggestions. I feel sad and agree with Dr. Cartunov that there is no short answer to this problems that arise in Eastern Europe, especially between the US and China relationship as well. But unfortunately, there is no one solution that will fit all the problems, that provide one answer to all the problems. US-Russia, China, or US-China relationship in Africa. I strongly believe it should be a targeted approach to each crisis. For example, let's look on situation what's happening just recently in Belarus. Yes, I agree with Helga, Ms. Helga, on situation on border of Belarus and Poland is bad. It's sad, but let's look what caused that issue. How those thousand and thousand immigrants ended in refugees, ended on the border. Who sponsors them? Where they take money to fly from Syria and end on a border with Poland? There is no border between those two countries. They had to fly. They had to get a visa. Someone sponsors them. It costs a couple $1,000s to get into this. And now, when situation is created, we're all sorry about this, what's happened. And I don't want to blame no one, don't want to blame Russia, but sounds like all the facts that we have, Belarus is the one who created this problem. Now they have to deal with this issue by themselves. Yes, it does the issue. Look on Russia-Ukraine relationship. Number one, we don't like sanctions, okay? Nobody likes sanctions, but this is a fact. And question, what is a proposal from a Russian side to end the sanctions? Is it going to be forever that we will say, no, we don't care what America is doing? Or you have a strategic plan how to move one step toward the resolution of that America can ease those sanctions? And where those troops, Russian troops ended on Ukrainian soil in Donetsk? Okay, definitely situation in Crimea with election and annexation of Crimea is kind of this can be disputed based on the history. However, the issue of Donetsk region has to be resolved, and Russia has to play a more significant role in resolving this issue. That would be probably the first step from east side toward the west. And again, I would like to see this, it's more not a question, but more like, what do you propose? What are you working on recommending your government, Russian government, in resolving this issue and easing those relationship between Russia and United States?
Okay, so that's your question. Okay.
Yes. What is a Russian approach to ease those relationship between two countries?
If it's a question to me, it's a big question. You know, speaking of the situation at the Polish-Ukrainian border, Polish-Belarusian border, I think one of the reasons why Lukashenko is not so cooperative is because he doesn't want to remain ostracized. He wants to be accepted as a legitimate leader of a country. And this is difficult because in Europe, especially if you take Poland, no one really wants to recognize Lukashenko as a rightful president of a sovereign country. I think that they will have to restart some kind of communication between Poland and Belarus. It is indispensable, though I also understand that some people in Poland might benefit from the current crisis because that distracts the attention in Europe from many problems that Warsaw has with Brussels. And I don't want to get into details, but definitely for the ruling coalition in Poland, this crisis is an opportunity to consolidate its electorate and to strengthen its domestic political positions. Now, when we get to Russia and the United States, I agree with you that Ukraine remains one of the most important issues which divides the two countries. And I think that the gap in perceptions in the United States and in Russia about what's going on in Ukraine is not likely to disappear anytime soon. However, I will sound trivial, but we should think about small incremental steps in the direction of the implementation of Minsk agreements. I understand that it's difficult to imagine how these agreements can be implemented in full. I think it will probably not happen. But we give advice to our government on specific measures in the military field in order to stabilize the situation, to reduce the risks of an inadvertent escalation, in order to make sure that there is a process of gradual stabilization of the situation in East Ukraine. And that includes monitoring missions and demining and expanding the number of OSCE observers and many other things which will not produce a revolution, but which might make the situation a little bit more predictable and hopefully a little bit less explosive. If you go beyond Ukraine, I think that what we really need to do strategically is to come up with some common understanding about what kind of world order we would like to have. In 5 years down the road, 10 years, 20 years down the road. I think that until we come to this common understanding between major powers, including the United States and China and Russia and the European Union, until we get to this point, it would be very difficult to work on specific issues. That's why, I'm a strong supporter of the idea there should be a peace meeting, maybe in New York, maybe elsewhere, where they should discuss not only strategic stability, which is important in itself, but they should discuss more general issues about how they would like to see the new global security ecosystem. I would even say security and development ecosystem, because if there is no understanding of the future, it's very difficult to deal with the problems of today. And I don't think that we will have any kind of breakthrough anytime soon. But I think that the instinct of self-preservation, something that Mrs. LaRouche referred to in the beginning of her presentation, the instinct of self-preservation, which hopefully is not lost by our species, should push the leaders in the direction of a more open and hopefully more strategy-focused dialogue. Again, I'm sorry I don't have enough time to get into detail, because your question, of course, implies a much more detailed, a much more specific answer. But at least, we should start moving.
Okay, very good. Ambassador, you have anything you want to add, or leave it?
Yes, just a couple of words, and refer to you for the two books that you mentioned about whom to blame and what to do. Questions is very important in this context as well, and emphasizing that Russia should do something to make a step forward is of course important, but we have to be sure that the other side, and in this case we are talking about Washington, is ready to make the steps, because the Ukraine issue is a Ukraine issue, first of all, but it's also an issue of Russian-American relations and the attitude of the relations between West and Russia. And it's important that our minister and also the president, when talking about Ukraine and any possible way forward, they always refer to the situation, how it all started. And in 2014, Russia was open for cooperation, for agreements, not only to people who were in Ukraine and at that time, but also with partners, with Barack Obama and Europeans, on how to get out of this Maidan situation in the best possible way. But it's well known that the coup happened the very day after these important president-level conversations took place, and we thought that the agreement or some kind of an understanding was found. And since then, the situation around Ukraine has been spiraling without control, and I must say it's not, probably there were some miscalculations on our side, but every time we made a step forward suggesting at least some tiny, there was a tiny opportunity to find some solutions on particular issues. Kiev was making a step back or two steps back. And it's easily, the situation, it's very easy to follow the events about the documents that were adopted by Normandy 4, and of course fundamental the Minsk agreements. But after that, the meetings of Normandy 4 agrees on something and it's not implemented. Normandy 4 is agreeing on something and it's not implemented. And you can imagine that Kiev in this sense, though having also huge internal problems in terms of moving forward, but every time we see that something is holding them back from implementation of Minsk agreements, and we are not there yet. And here I can come to what Andrey has just said. I think it's at this point of time, it's very important that there is a frank discussion, mutually respectful discussion about how we see the international system now, and what could be the balance of powers and the new approach to relations between Russia, US, Russia, Europe, and US, Russia, China, and etc. The major polars of contemporary system. And here comes the idea of our president to hold a summit, P5 permanent members of the Security Council summit. That I think that the idea was first floated about a couple of years ago to start this conversation about the approaches to the world, to regional conflicts, to the strategic issues. And it didn't happen since then. Of course, COVID contributed much in not holding it in person, but it didn't happen even in VTC format. So, and please rest assured that it was not Russia blocking its own proposal. But I still hope we're working on this so these meetings happen. And hopefully there is an understanding that it's such a conversation is very, very needed now for all of us, for our countries, but also for the world. Thank you.
Okay, just wanted to see, Helga, if you have anything that you'd like to add at this point.
Well, I think that, sometimes when, two people or two groups of people have tensions, they cannot resolve that if they only stick to the issues which divide them. Sometimes the only way how you can make progress is that you address an issue which is of higher importance and the importance of all of mankind. And it has been my conviction for a long time that the proposal by President Putin for a P5 meeting would be an absolute important step in this direction, because there must be some gremium which has a plan of how to address the issues which are exploding right now: the migration, the famine, the pandemic. I mean, we have an existential crisis, and I think if the P5 nations, I'm frankly not so optimistic about the British component of that combination, but so be it, that, if there would be a plan how to overcome these three problems: the famine, the COVID pandemic effects, and the migration, which is the consequence of all of this. And there would be a plan how to work together to develop Africa, to develop Southwest Asia, and some other areas like Haiti and maybe other countries as well. I think that if there would be a joint statement and joint plan from the major powers, it would have the support of the whole world. I think that kind of leadership is really what everybody would be extremely important about, because first of all, it's very urgent, and secondly, right now the international situation reminds me more like a lawless situation. Naturally, the UN Security Council is still there, but ever since the Libya intervention, it was lied to, sort of. In any case, I think that sometimes to overcome tensions among major countries and also people is to define a goal which addresses the need of humanity as a whole. And then you would have the support of, all the countries in the world, maybe except 2 or 3. But I think such a plan, such a vision is urgently needed.
All right. Well, I want to thank particularly Ambassador Anna Evgenyeva for being with us. We are going to close out this section. And Helga, Dr. Lazansky wanted to get an answer to his question, but I think you've got a series of Americans we're about to hear from. So if you either want to answer that question now, or do you want me to just continue? Because we have, a set of other presentations.
I think we should continue, and I reflect about the answer.
Yeah, because actually the question, which was, could we take a poll of Americans to see how we could actually address the dire situation, is in part answered by the presentations that we're going to have. So we're want to thank everybody that was involved in the discussion, and we're now going to resume our presentations. The first presentation we'll be hearing from will be Colonel Richard Black, former state senator and former chief of the Army Criminal Law Division, the Office of the Judge Advocate General of the Pentagon. And his topic was U.S.-China relations, potential for war avoidance and cooperation.
I'm Senator Black. Let me start by saying that I have a military background. I was in heavy ground combat with the 1st Marine Division. Wounded, both my radio men were killed fighting beside me. I had been a helicopter pilot and flew 269 combat missions, hit by ground fire on 4 occasions. After law school, I served as a JAG officer and eventually was chief of the Criminal Law Division, testifying before Congress and preparing executive orders for the president's signature. I mention all this simply to make the point that I am patriotic. I've shed blood for the country, but I have no interest in fighting in the defense of Taiwan or for the glory of the global oligarchs who profit so much from war I'm concerned by growing Sino-American tensions, and I disagree with those who feel that the United States must ensure hegemony in Asia. So let me start by reviewing the situation with Taiwan. China regards Taiwan as a vital national interest. And having recognized a one China policy for decades, it's dangerous for the U.S. to reverse its long-standing policy that recognized that Taiwan was simply an integral part of China. President Nixon's historic visit to the People's Republic of China in 1971 led to a dramatic improvement in trade and security relations that raised living standards enormously for both Americans and Chinese. These momentous accomplishments were founded on the Shanghai Communique, which still is the basis for bilateral relations today. Nixon and Chinese Premier Zhou Enlai accommodated their divergent views on the issue of Taiwan by setting out a one China, two systems policy. And as long as that approach was handled with sensitivity and respect, we have maintained peace and harmony for half a century afterwards. Just to keep in mind, back in 1971, the U.S. permitted the United Nations General Assembly to enact Resolution 2758 that recognized the People's Republic of China as the only legitimate representative in the United Nations. So the government in Beijing replaced the Republic of China in Taiwan on the powerful five-member UN Security Council. And as a result, most nations switched their diplomatic relations to Beijing and away from Taiwan. It was in 1979 that the U.S. formally recognized the People's Republic of China as being the legitimate government there in Beijing, and we terminated formal relations with Taiwan at that point. I think everyone recognized that at some point, however distant, China would eventually be reunited under the PRC government in Beijing. Now, what happened is the unprecedented growth in trade between China and the United States inevitably caused some disagreements. And President Trump raised very legitimate issues about intellectual property and about the balance of trade. At first, those issues were addressed respectfully, but as domestic political pressures increased, both Democrats and Republicans began to adopt a more militant approach towards China, each party accusing the other of being soft on China. And eventually, this escalated until there was a shrill cacophony of hostile, unreasoning voices accusing China of all sorts of things. There were exaggerated claims about Chinese intentions towards Taiwan, and those triggered provocative military actions, including the dispatch of U.S. naval vessels to the Strait of Taiwan, which was a show of force essentially calculated to embarrass China. The growing Sino-American tensions have damaged both parties. I think that American leaders would be wise to rekindle the spirit of friendship that was President Richard M. Nixon's most enduring legacy to the world. The PRC would unquestionably be relieved if tensions over Taiwan would dissipate, and the U.S. can help by adopting a less provocative and more conciliatory tone. Resolving the one China issue is not the responsibility of the United States. It's an internal matter for resolution by the Chinese people. They have great patience and left to their own devices, they'll resolve the matter in a peaceful and mutually acceptable fashion. Now, let me shift briefly to the issue of the Uyghurs in Xinjiang province of China. We have many of the war hawks seeking to raise tensions with China, and they have seized on the plight of the Uyghurs to portray them in a sympathetic fashion. The situation is really much more complex. The Xinjiang province is a huge, arid northwestern region of China, sparsely populated. The United States has imposed sanctions on the production of goods produced by Uyghurs in the province, and that in turn has taken away jobs from Uyghurs and exacerbated their poverty. Now, just as the United States implemented actions to deter terrorism that we experienced on 9/11 and also after Pearl Harbor in the Second World War, the Chinese have similar motivations to suppress terrorism and to ensure the security of their people. In 2014, a knife-wielding group of terrorists seized the Kunming train station in Xinjiang province. They slashed Han Chinese with knives in a highly publicized and very brutal attack. Over 170 people were killed or wounded by the knife-slashing terrorists. These were Uyghur separatists who carried a hand-painted East Turkestan flag, and they slaughtered dozens and dozens of helpless people. Those militants intend to adopt a 7th century brutal Islamic government, and they also are determined that they will purge all of the Han Chinese from this enormous province of China. The Chinese government simply had to react. There is no way that they could accept their people being slaughtered and expelled from a portion of their country. Now, reports that large numbers of Uyghurs have been placed in internment camps need to be put somewhat in perspective. If you go back to the Second World War, which was not really that long ago historically, after Pearl Harbor was attacked, the United States put all Japanese Americans in remote internment camps. Now, the Japanese Americans at that time had no record of violence against the American public at large. And yet it was uncontroversial to place them in internment camps. And even nations of South, Central, and Central America and Canada joined in what we were doing, and they placed Japanese citizens in internment camps. So I think we should be a little bit less critical of China, because unlike their situation, the Japanese Americans had never done anything to us, whereas the Uyghur militants have been extremely violent and disruptive. Now, there are many, many very fine Uyghur citizens, but the violent element is significant, and the Chinese government simply must take action and react. I would mention that there is a brigade of Uyghur militants presently acting under Al-Qaeda command in Idlib province of Syria. And they are situated there in order to learn terrorist tactics that they can eventually take back to China and use to overthrow the government of China there. Terrorism is a very, very dangerous thing for all nations, as we've experienced. And I think that we should refrain from releasing the Central Intelligence Agency to take actions that would enhance the terrorist activities of the Uyghurs in northwest China, and refrain from making the Uyghurs pawns in a dangerous game that destabilizes the world. Now, finally, let me just touch briefly on our actions regarding the quadrilateral security dialogue, what's called the Quad. The United States has recently formed an alliance of the United States, Australia, India, and Japan that has coordinated militarily and become increasingly hostile towards China. It is troubling to see that alliance take shape at the same time that the State Department and the Central Intelligence Agency seem to be moving quietly to perhaps encourage terrorist activities by the Uyghurs in China. I don't believe that the United States or the world benefits from instigating instability with China. That risks escalating into a major war that could become a thermonuclear war. Tensions that are being promoted with both Russia and China are dangerous and counterproductive. Nations must recognize that future global conflicts among the great powers are likely to escalate into thermonuclear war. In that event, the survival of mankind is uncertain. World leaders need to take bold steps to normalize trade, suppress terrorism, and restore Nixon's long-lasting vision of Sino-American peace and prosperity. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Black. Now we are going to hear from Dr. George Koo, the chairman of the Burlingame Foundation, named after the Anson Burlingame, was Abraham Lincoln's ambassador to China, was found in 1861. And he's a retired international business consultant as well. His topic is the survival of our world depends on whether the United States and China can get along.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate the opportunity to participate in this very important conference, and I want to thank the Schiller Institute for putting this together. My topic reflects my concern. I'm very worried about the conflict that's developing between U.S. and China, and I think the survival of our world depends on the two countries getting along. The most frequently heard accusations the United States has been levying on China can be enumerated in the following way. First, our Congress people, senators, congressmen, used to accuse China of currency manipulation, which is kind of absurd because China pegged the exchange rate to the dollar. And the reason the manipulation occurs is because we have deliberately weakened the dollar. Now, we have also, especially during the Trump presidency, accused China of unfair trade practices. And therefore, we levied tariffs on Chinese goods. Well, this hasn't done anything to restore the trade deficit. It, in fact, has created inflation and the cost of living for the American people. It did not make sense from a basic economic point of view. We also accused China of stealing intellectual property. Well, in the very early days of the formation, when China started to open up to the West, they did require forming joint ventures for foreign companies wishing to enter in China, and they encourage the investment of technology and proprietary technology as part of their equity investment, as much as 25% of the equity. So in that sense, China was able to bring in technology, but that was at a time when China was very backward, very poor, and they need to figure out how to invest and bring in Western technology. Not very different from when the early American colonial days, when they were so far behind the British Industrial Revolution. And Alexander Hamilton, in fact, specifically sent American people to London to steal trade secrets. But that's a long time ago. And it's an exaggeration by the politicians in Washington to say that China is stealing hundreds of billions of technology from the United States. In point of fact, China has been now developing their own proprietary technology, and in many areas, they have now surpassed the American state of know-how. And so it's kind of absurd to say that a company like Huawei, for example, is stealing technology that the United States never had. And fourth and favorite accusation is China is accused of human rights abuses. Well, how can you practice rampant human rights abuses when you take 850 million people out of poverty? China has repeatedly shown they care about the livelihood of every citizen inside China. And based on their Belt and Road Initiative around the world, they show they care about the livelihood of everybody around the world. This is in very distinct contrast to the United States promotion of democracy and individual freedom, and wherever they go, death and destruction followed, such as, and most recently, of course, as the end of the forever war in Afghanistan. China is also accused of being a threat to U.S. national security. And as a result, ethnic Chinese Americans working in the science and technology field in the United States are harassed by the FBI, arrested without due process, their career and livelihood destroyed, and then without any apology or any offer of compensation, the Department of Justice frequently then just drop all the charges and leave these people to dangle by themselves. Another way of dealing with China as a threat to national security is our so-called freedom of navigation in South China Sea. We are threatening China by patrolling around the shores. In earlier days, we fly on the Chinese airspace to spy on what's going on, and yet we accuse them of being a threat, especially when we make a provocation and they respond, and then we say, see, their response is a provocation. The most important, accusation of national security is how we are pushing the line in Taiwan, especially when Pompeo was the Secretary of State and continued by the current Biden administration. We seem to have failed to honor and recognize the Shanghai Communique entered when Nixon visited China, recognizing that Taiwan has always been part of China. What we are doing is encouraging the Taipei government headed by DPP into thinking that the Americans will come to their aid if they should push too far. And this is a third rail that will put all of our security, the whole world's security, at risk. When all that is said and done, and by the way, we also say China cannot be trusted because they're not like a Western democracy. Well, you know, if the United States is a model of Western democracy, we are setting a terrible example. In recent Pew Research surveys show approximately 80% of the nations surveyed, like UK, Germany, France, so on and so forth, 80% of the people believe the United States is no longer a worthy model of democracy. And that 80% figure includes the people of the United States. That just shows how far the US has strayed. The real reason China is considered an adversary and threat is because the Chinese economy threatens to overtake the US, and that seems to something that the people in Washington can't stand. In terms of Belt and Road, China has qualified themselves because of all the infrastructure investment they made since the financial crisis of 2008. They built bridges, they built highways, they built high-speed rail. Now they're taking their expertise to the rest of the world and offering it to help the other countries. One simple example should illustrate how effective they have been. In Hanoi, they built a metro station, elevated, in 7 years' time. It was a 13.5 kilometer, 12 station. It's completed in 7 years. It's now operating. Japan also bid on a metro line. They started and it has been operating for 9 years, still not complete. It's 87% complete. And the cost overrun has canceled the low cost financing that Japan offered in the first place. So I have to ask, is China qualified to benefit the rest of the world? Can the U.S., with the recent Belt and Road initiative that Biden has announced, can they provide a competitive type of offer? Maybe so, maybe not. In any case, Belt and Road type of initiative should not be win-lose. It should be a win-win for everybody. So where are we going? Where are the two countries going at this point? Well, we are threatening, the United States is threatening to cut China off on access to any American technology, and denying semiconductors to Huawei, for example, is probably the most obvious example. Well, this will force China to go their own ways. And with their resources and their motivation, sooner or later, they will be able to develop their own indigenous technology. And that is a lose-lose outcome, because companies like TSMC, for example, will lose a good size of their market to China, and China will be able to build their own. Both markets will be smaller than the whole, and that's a losing outcome. The other difference is that because China is a one-party system, once they have consensus, they get things done. They move quickly. In the United States, especially the most recent three administrations, from Obama to Trump to Biden, they have been very good at kicking the can down the road. No politician wants to state the obvious and talk about common goals, common interests. They are always out to snipe on the other country. So what we are now seeing is that the world is moving away from the hegemony of the United States and looking to develop a multipolar world. And the United States doesn't seem to understand and recognize that this is the trend. We seem to be spending our energy trying to push China's head underwater rather than trying to compete on our own. In the meantime, China is focusing on the development of their technology and developing their economy. There's no question that China's economy if not already surpassing U.S., certainly has on the purchasing power parity, and it's inevitable with their number of people that they will surpass the size of the U.S. economy. I think it's quite obvious that we need the two largest economies to collaborate and work together. There are so many global problems that needs cooperation, not competition. It needs the countries thinking about win-win outcome. For example, enabling global stability and avoid nuclear winter. For example, controlling the refugee flow and stopping human trafficking. Combating and preventing pandemics. Diverting from arming to raising human life and human dignity. United to fight global terrorism. So in short, I just want to emphasize that it's important for all of us to recognize and understand the only way for everybody to win is for the two countries to stop the Cold War nonsense and start to figure out how to work together, and picking and choosing one issue to blacken and beat up on China and pick another issue to work together, that's just not going to work. Thank you very much. Appreciate the opportunity.
Thank you, Dr. Koo. The next presentation is by Kirk Wiebe, Senior Analyst, retired, from the United States National Security Agency and a member of the Veteran Intelligence Professionals for Sanity. His topic today is Dobre bratstvo, luše je bogatstvo. Brotherhood is the best wealth.
I am a longtime member of the Veteran Intelligence Professionals for Sanity, often referred to as VIPS, V-I-P-S. As that name implies, we are deeply concerned as to how intelligence failures, as well as manipulation of the truth, can lead to catastrophic consequences. This happened with the Iraq War of 2003. Earlier, it happened with respect to not preventing 9/11, which led to the 20-year Afghanistan war. I and Bill Binney resigned from the National Security Agency on October 31st, 2001, because we were prevented from using means readily available to us prior to 9/11 that would have prevented those terrorist attacks from occurring. We were prevented by corrupt elements of our intelligence community and our government, which have never been held accountable. Trillions of dollars and millions of lives on both sides of the resulting wars have been lost. More importantly, the world has become less safe, not more safe, over the past 20 years. I believe that any talk of potential military confrontation or war with Russia, China, or other nations must be thoroughly discussed with the American people, as it never is, and by those, such as myself, in a position to reveal the true way these decisions are made, decisions which are often the opposite of those in the true interest of the United States itself. In my time at the National Security Agency, I specialized in intelligence pertaining to Russia. 4 years ago, Bill Binney and I, at the height of the Russiagate hoax, came to New York City to discuss our view that the story that Russia hacked the Democratic National Committee was in no way corroborated by evidence. The case of Julian Assange, we contend, and a different way, the case of Ed Snowden. If allowed to be heard by the people of the world, especially the grossly uninformed American people, would clear up mysteries. There is, in my view, no sign that Russia, and I very much doubt that China, wants a war with the United States. But there is also no doubt that if the events of 9/11 had been prevented, as I, Bill Binney, Diane Rourke, and others know they could have been, that the Afghanistan tragedy, the Iraq tragedy, and other lethal expeditions, including our roles in Libya and Syria, would not have been supported by the American people. Sanity must prevail. In conclusion, I would like to say to my Russian counterparts what I recently said at the Teardrop Memorial, located in Bayonne, New Jersey, and dedicated by the nation of Russia to the United States in memory of the victims of 9/11. Дорогие русские друзья, мне бы хотелось сказать вот что. Мы все собираемся здесь в атмосфере братства и дружбы, также любви. Мы, американцы, искренне благодарим вас за такой чудный, красивый, также вдохновительный монумент и памятник всем, кто умер или были ранены в тот трагический день 20 лет тому назад. Знайте, что мы постоянно стоим вместе с вами, друг с другом, как попутники в борьбе за истину и в борьбе против терроризма. Искренне благодарю вас за внимание. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Wiebe, as well. I'm going to read a statement which was a statement of greetings written for the conference by former Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces of Bolivia, Edwin de la Fuente. He's the General of the Army. And he says, as a military man who is today involved in the politics of my country, Bolivia, I find myself impressed as never before with the activity of the Schiller Institute, led by that great comrade in arms, Helga Zepp-LaRouche. Her efforts to awaken the conscience of the world are laudable, and especially her concern for the enormous problems that threaten the planet's security, which she describes with simplicity and clarity. She is following in the footsteps of her late husband, that strategic genius, Lyndon LaRouche, who contributed so much to world peace and, like the great economist that he was, gave us so much just by saying that the world economic system was at its end and was a crime against the survival of the human race and therefore to world peace. There's no doubt that our compañera, Helga, is a worthy representative of her late husband, Lyndon. This weekend's video conference will also be unsettling as world society has the responsibility of resolving the problems of hunger and misery in Afghanistan and Haiti, demanding that the great powers put a halt to the possible loss of thousands of citizens, primarily children, in these countries, a crime of lèse humanité. I believe that in these 2 days we can remove many doubts, but more importantly, learn about a positive economic policy in these moments of crisis. I've been an admirer of the Schiller Institute and of Lyndon LaRouche from the time that I first had an opportunity to be nourished by their activities, studies, and research, but more than anything, what stood out to me was their concern for humanity without distinction of class, race, or nationality. They were also harsh critics of the United States and its economic system, its policies, and especially its political actions in response to world problems. And today, Helga's leadership continues to impress us and force us to continue to listen and learn. Thank you very much. Now what we're going to do is going to return to our questions and answers. We have a limited period of time, but there are a few matters that we want to make sure get addressed. And so I guess the first thing I'd like to do is ask and see whether or not Helga wants to take up now. And I see, Dr. Koo, you're with us too. Thank you very much for being here. But I wanted to know, Helga, whether you want to take up now that question from Ed Lazansky, and I'll just reference it to people who may not have heard it earlier. And he just asked this question: taking into account the most dangerous situation, is there any way to poll the American people about their attitude to the current U.S. policy toward Russia? I'd like to actually take the opportunity to extend that question because I think that Dr. Koo may have equally a view of how to handle the problem of registering the actual view of the American people toward China as well. But just wanted to know, Helga, if you want to take that up now.
Well, I think the best way of approaching this is what we are doing with this conference. And I would urge all our participants and viewers to help to enlarge the audience of such fora, because as people may know, YouTube basically put a 1 week closing of our channel because of a program which was aired in January, and it just hits this conference. So, there's obviously, not exactly only joy about what we are doing here, but I think it's very important because, it is my deepest conviction, based not only on experience, but also on, knowledge and studying. I think the first simple thing is, in my view, neither Russia nor China are aggressive nations. And the picture which is painted by the think tanks and the mainstream media about, all kinds of dubious aggressions and, devious plans, and it's just not true. I mean, I have not seen any case where when China or Russia were accused of something, it was not exactly the other way around, like in the case of Ukraine, I mean, which was mentioned earlier. The vote in the Crimea of the Crimean people to be part of Russia was the result of a Nazi coup, which was sponsored by the West. Victoria Nuland is famous or infamous for her statements, which are well known to everybody. She bragged that the United States spent 5 billion people on NGOs in Ukraine alone for regime change. The Maidan, we have documented in great detail. So what happened in Crimea was a reaction to a coup. And, I mean, we know what happened in the period before. Then Foreign Minister Steinmeier was in Kiev these days. So there's no way how the Western leaders don't know exactly what happened. And I think a lot of dishonesty is in this reporting. And I fully agree with what Senator Black said about China and the Uyghurs. I fully agree with what Dr. Koo said. The accusations against China are really not based on any reality. And I think it is really important that people take a step back, and try to understand the other country, the history. And I'm thanking Kirk Wiebe that he, quotes Chinese, Russian poetry, and also, Ray McGovern, whom I wish well, does that also, which I think is very, very important. So I can only say the best thing to pull the American people, in the direction of wanting to have a good relations is, we have to build a constituency. We have to build people like what the Schiller Institute intention was from the very beginning. You can have World War III with anybody once you start to focus on negative points, on you make up, bad histories and whatnot. But if you focus on the best tradition, you can immediately build friendship and trust. And I think that is most urgently needed. So I would encourage more Russian culture, more Chinese cultural exhibitions, more, more discussion of the beauty of the other culture, and vice versa, because the image of the United States needs urgently to be repaired in many countries around the world as well. So I would really say we have to make a new face and start to really relate to the other nations from the standpoint of, that all nations and all cultures have something to contribute, and many of them did contribute great things. And once you start to relate to that, you can actually build a community of nations which are in friendship. And I think that is the way to go. And there must be a popular movement demanding that. And I would encourage everybody who agrees with what I'm saying, join the Schiller Institute and become part of that effort.
Okay, thank you very much. Dr. Koo, you have any remarks that you'd like to make at this point?
Yeah, I'll try to make it very short. I think the biggest, most fundamental problem that we have, as Senator Blake pointed out, the American people are badly uninformed. And because they're uninformed, they can be led by the media and by the politicians and go along with all the distortions and fabrications that makes the bilateral relations between U.S. and China so negative and so difficult to reverse and to change the trend. So I think we do have an uphill battle here, and certainly things that the Schiller Institute and others are doing, trying to shed more light on reality and on the truth, is important and is a continuing battle. And until the American people understand and realize that our leaders are putting our lives at risk, our sons and daughters, grandkids, their future at risk, until the American people object and will start to listen to real leaders that speaks at what's really at stake, and not the petty issues between the Republicans and the Democrats. Until that happens, I should say in a positive way, when that happens, then I can see some hope in reversing this dismal trend that we're at. Thank you.
Okay. I think we have a questioner. This is Madison Tang, I think, from Code Pink. Hi, are you able to hear us?
Hi, yes. Can you hear me?
Yes. Yes, go right ahead.
Great. Thanks for having me, and thanks for this conference by the Schiller Institute. And sorry, I think I'm getting a little feedback. Let me just make sure. Okay. I think that should be better. I'm with Code Pink Women for Peace and the China is Not Our Enemy campaign, working to end US-led aggression on China. So I will say that I think we have some different understandings, and we also have consensus. Our values and beliefs are that we do need a big tent to stop US aggression on China and to create a prosperous future for all of our people and our planet, including human and non-human life. And I think for us, the idea of the cost to the planet from nuclear winter has been mentioned, or global war, is too severe to risk escalating tensions further. And I think it's time to stop the idea of a national security that we're working for. Instead, we need to securitize people if we're going to survive on the planet. And that includes prioritizing food security, as we've discussed today, as well as the need for renewable and clean energy. So I don't think these two things, I think they can coexist in being prioritized as needs. And one great example is Chinese scientists developing technology to produce animal feed from industrial gas byproducts. This would reduce their soy imports, which are now 80% of consumption, and reduce CO2 emissions at the same time, which is really remarkable technological advancement. But my question kind of builds on Dr. George Koo talking about how China in the West view can't be trusted because it's not a Western democracy. And then on the reverse side, we also see that Chinese and Russian leaders don't have a lot of trust or faith in the US government and its leaders because of a long history of reneging on agreements, hypocritical policies and statements, and just bad faith negotiations. And one or two examples of this is the presidential executive branch authority to withdraw the United States from international treaties without the consent of Congress, like we saw with the INF treaty with Russia. Another is right now, Representative Elaine Luria, a Congressmember in Virginia is calling to expand Biden's authority to go to war with China over Taiwan. This would be without congressional approval. So that's one thing Code Pink is advocating against, trying to call to get folks to be aware that this risk of nuclear war is very real. So how can we find other ways to build this trust? What are some opportunities for building trust between the governments of the US and China in particular for these panelists in order to create more bilateralism that is built on a better foundation of trust? Any ideas for that? Thanks.
Okay.
Well, I'll make a quick comment, and I really hate to be such a negative person, but I think the American people has to understand China has steadily said that they will not be the first to fire, but they must have a credible second strike capability to deter anybody, any other country of thinking that they could launch an attack on China. And this is why they have been making so much technological advances in such thing as hypersonic missile and so on, just because they want to make sure that their threat is being treated seriously. And it's important American people understand that if our leaders in Washington starts anything, everybody will have to pay. And it's very, very serious and deadly.
Helga?
Well, I think if you ask around in African nations or Latin American nations, you will find that people generally are so thankful and appreciative because the Western powers could have developed Africa, Latin America, and much of Asia, even parts of Europe, but they didn't. They did not. I mean, China came, and once they were in a position to do that, actually, they wanted to do it much earlier because at the conference of the regions along the Eurasian land bridge, which took place in '96 in Beijing, which I participated on, already at that time, China said that the Eurasian land bridge was the strategic long-term perspective of China until the year 2010. And projects were being built, like the railway to Iran and things like that. But then came the Asia crisis of '97, and this was a systemic crisis, which was then continued with the Russia GKO crisis. So the whole thing got stopped. But in the moment when China felt strong enough to make the initiative of the new Silk Road, they did. And in 8 years, this has become the largest infrastructure development program in the history of mankind ever. It completely dwarfs the Marshall Plan. And if other nations would take up the offer of the Chinese government to cooperate in a win-win way, I think China would be very happy because the more countries would contribute, it would increase the stability, it would increase the benefits. So I think that there must be a real serious rethinking because Dr. Koo said earlier that 850 million people of their own people have been lifted out of poverty. And I have been in China the first time in '71 during the Cultural Revolution, and I have a very vivid memory and many pictures from that time. And if I compare that to today, there is nothing like that. There has never been such a transformation of any country for the benefit of its own people. And they are now basically saying that they want to have a moderate, beautiful world, advanced culturally, and by the year 2050 or 2049. And if countries would just say, let's do that, we are in such an incredible moment of history. Let's join hands and really do these tasks, like developing of all the countries which are right now in a terrible need. You know what it means to be hungry every day? Almost 1 billion people are hungry every day. 2 billion people have no fresh water. So if, there would be just a stop of this stupid geopolitical confrontation, and one would say the tasks of humanity are so enormous. Why don't we join hands and cooperate? It is just a small step, but it must be taken, and it should be supported by more and more people so that there is a pressure from the population on the government to go in this direction. And I think that is what we have to build.
Okay. You have any response? Do you have anything? That's fine.
Oh, I appreciate. Yeah, I think that the Belt and Road Initiative can be very much a alternative path forward, especially an alternative to U.S. unilaterally imposed sanctions, which are creating a lot of the famines and food insecurity globally. So, thank you.
Okay. Very good. Thank you very much for your question. Helga, I think our final question for today, for this panel, is the following. My question is about the role of education in a time of crisis. John Quincy Adams is known for bringing the Russian language into school classrooms. This was the 19th century, and believed that the next generation of students should value the culture and history of their distant friends. Could this be done today while including Chinese and Russian as languages, I think, to be taught in schools, and these cultures to be taught in part of the curriculum, and what would the long-term effect of that be?
Well, I'm convinced since a long time that, once you would give to every child, a newborn child, no matter where it's born, the advantage of a universal education in the tradition of Wilhelm von Humboldt, who said that the aim of education is a beautiful character. And Humboldt defined that there are certain categories of knowledge which are more suitable to accomplish that beautiful character than others. One of them being, the command of your own high language in the form of poetry, the learning of other languages, the knowledge about universal history, the natural sciences, as well as music and and things like that. That every child has the potential to become a genius, and no second person will ever become another Einstein or another Beethoven, because genius is very unique. But can you imagine what it would do in terms of making a curriculum where children learn about universal history from the very beginning, that you take the history of humanity as your own, rather than just what your village or your nation has been accomplished. People grow up in a different species. And my late husband, Lyndon LaRouche, at some point in his life started to talk about that however important the nation state is, and it probably will be important for a very long time to come, because of tradition, culture, language, but that there will be another form of government or another form of living together for the human species, which surpasses that. And I think the pre-taste of that is how the astronauts are working together on the ISS, how astronauts report about their view on the planet from outer space. You realize the vastness of the universe. And if you remember the beautiful words of Lyndon LaRouche, which we heard at the beginning of this conference, we are a human species in a very large universe. 2 trillion galaxies are known to exist so far. If we want to survive what Lynn was saying about the great extinction, which takes place approximately every 65 million years, that may not be what your ordinary politician is concerned about, because he thinks about the next election date. But if we want to think about becoming the immortal species, which I think we should, because it would be such a waste if all the beautiful music by Beethoven would be composed for no reason, or the works of Pushkin and other great poets from other countries. So we have to start thinking of how we as a human species can make steps in the direction of the long-term survivability of our species. And, to stop the stupid conflict among the nuclear powers, it's the first step, because if we can't manage that, there is the danger of an annihilation of the human species, and it's much closer than most people think. So I think learning the other languages, and I would please involve also German, which happens to be a very beautiful language, and many pearls can be found if you master German. I think that is an absolute right step to go. So I would really join our listeners. We can make a renaissance, which if we exchange the knowledge about the other great cultural traditions, I'm absolutely certain that is the kind of environment in which a new renaissance can occur. And why should we always be condemned to the ugliness of our present so-called popular culture, that will be discussed tomorrow. But I think, there must be a desire for beauty, for, solving the problems. And I think that we are on the verge of accomplishing that if there are enough people of goodwill.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Helga. And that will be the concluding remark that we'll give for today's panel. We are going to be for panel 1. And panel 2 will be beginning at 2 p.m. That's in about 45 minutes, 2 p.m. Eastern time. We realize that we have people who are on from all over the world. We hope that you can stay with us for that panel. It is called The Science of Physical Economy. And we, again, welcome you all to become members of the Schiller Institute. And you'll be able to get more information. You can see at the bottom of our screen there a way to click onto that link and find out more. And for those who want to get some of the collected works of Lynn and LaRouche, we referenced before the volume of Lynn and LaRouche's collected works. This is the first of several volumes that will be being published by the LaRouche Legacy Foundation. So we'll see you again here, hopefully, in 45 minutes.